This week I'm joined by Sheldon Solomon, who is one of the co-developers of terror management theory and a co-author of the book The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life. In this episode we discuss human mortality, death anxiety, and the meaning of life in relation to death. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support the podcast or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. So, Sheldon Solomon, thanks very much for joining us on Hermetic's podcast.
My pleasure, James.
You've actually been recommended by so many people, and this book in particular, so many people wanted you on. So, I'm super thankful you're on. We're going to be talking about, in short, we're going to be talking about death, but we're going to be talking about your book, The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life, which I believe was published in 2015. But before we jump in on that, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and how you came to be so interested in the end of it all.
Yeah, well, I am by training an experimental social psychologist. I teach at Skidmore College, which is a little liberal arts school in upstate New York. My interest in matters pertaining to life and death is both personal and professional. On the personal front, I've been really radically disinclined to die for as long as I can remember. And I tell this tale a lot, but I remember it vividly being 8 or 9 years old, the day after my grandmother died. And my mom said the day before, say goodbye to grandma. She's not well. And I knew she wasn't well. She died the next day, and I'm sitting around, a little kid, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to miss my grandmother. And I had a stamp collection, and I was looking at postage stamps of dead American presidents. And I was like, wow, I guess all these presidents are dead. My grandmother's dead. Oh, that means my mom's going to grow old and die. And that made me miserable, because then where's my dinner going to come from? And then literally, like someone had dropped a planet on top of my head. I made the final connection between myself and the rest of the animate world, and realized that I too would someday die. And I had, I think, a minor existential crisis that I was able to bury psychologically for a couple of decades. I would ruminate about it from time to time, but then fast forward, 15 or 20 years, I finished my PhD in psychology, and I got a job at Skidmore. And it was in my first week as a professor at Skidmore that I stumbled by accident onto the books of Ernest Becker, who from your other work and talking with Dan Lechte, was at the time a recently deceased cultural anthropologist. And there were 3 books next to each other at the Skidmore Library: The Birth and Death of Meaning, The Denial of Death, and Escape from Evil. And I found the titles quite captivating. So I grabbed The Birth and Death of Meaning, and in the first paragraph, Becker says, I want to understand why people do what they do when they do it. Mm-hmm. There was something like that. And I'm like, geez, me too. After getting a PhD, having to wade through mind-numbing jargon and hyper-specialization, here's a guy just saying, I want to understand why people do stupid shit. And he insisted that it would require a very broad interdisciplinary approach and I found that very appealing. And then the next book on the shelf, The Denial of Death, in the first paragraph, he said it's the uniquely human awareness of death that gives rise to potentially debilitating existential terror. And it is in our ongoing efforts as a species and as individuals to deny the reality of the human condition that, whether we're aware of it or not, ultimately determines just about everything that we think and do. And I saw that, and I'm like, oh, man, I don't want to see that. But that in my gut struck me as quite correct. And then the Escape from Evil book, I didn't get to for a couple of weeks, but in there, Becker just says that most of the evil in the world is the result of people self-righteously trying to rid the world of evil in an effort to assuage their own death anxiety. So to make a short story long, I was hooked. I called my buddies Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski from graduate school. I said, you have to read this guy. He's explaining everything we wanted to understand. Why do people need self-esteem? Why do we cling so tenaciously to our beliefs to the point where we're willing to annihilate somebody because they don't worship the same God or pledge to the same flag? And then what happened is we started trotting around Earth talking about Becker's ideas, much to the consternation of most academic psychologists. So on the one hand, theologians, English professors, just regular people, they found Becker's ideas quite appealing. Psychologists were repulsed, maybe by us, but by the ideas themselves. Becker won a Pulitzer Prize, but couldn't get a job. And the argument was that he was an entertaining lecturer whose ideas might be of interest, but they can't be of value because there's no evidence for them. And it would just be impossible to find evidence in support of his claims. And his claim, very simply, is that the way that we manage death anxiety is by embracing culturally constructed belief systems that give us a sense that life has meaning and we have value, and that we therefore, quite unaware, spend all of our waking moments, for the most part, devoted to maintaining confidence in our worldview, as well as confidence in our value as individuals. And it was after years of trying to publish just a paper describing Becker's ideas that the editor said, you're not going to get anywhere unless you can, quote, prove this by traditional scientific standards. Now, half of me was like, well, fuck that. These ideas are too big. And you're being an intellectual fascist when you claim that there's only one way to derive evidence for any particular notion. On the other hand, we were in fact trained as scientists to use the scientific method, not as the only way to triangulate on a better understanding of the world around us, but surely a real good one, because as far as we can tell, no method has done better to date at pointing out not so much what's true, but ruling out what's not true. So for the last 35, almost 40 years, we have, under the rubric of terror management theory, which was just our effort to take Becker's 12 or 14 books and condense them into a paragraph of theoretical statements from which we could derive hypotheses that could then be subjected to empirical scrutiny. So English translation, we've been testing Becker's ideas, and we now believe that there's an impressive body of evidence, a big chunk of which has been collected by independent researchers around the world that have no connection to our lab. And I think that's what makes this work compelling. If you're the only one doing it, that's interesting, but it doesn't become science until other folks are able to replicate your findings and are sufficiently interested to undertake those ventures.
Okay. I think I've jotted down probably about 4 or 5 questions based off what you said there. Especially, I'm really interested in your personal existential experience when you were young. There, I think I probably had roughly the same thing. I guess you maybe be surprised to find people who didn't go into philosophy or theory that didn't have that kind of thing happen, and that's the reason most of them end up is saying, "Oh God, I'm gonna die. I need, I've got this 70 years left to quickly find some reason." But before we jump into these things and the specifics of the book, I do have to ask you the Hamidics question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listening on the conversation. Who do you pick?
Yeah, that question, which you sent me ahead of time, has kept me agitated and awake since I saw it. And I just, I don't know, I've had so many triads And and this may sound silly, but of late I've been wanting Abraham Lincoln and Bob Marley, and on top of that, Abraham Lincoln, Bob Marley. And of late, this will be an odd one, but Karen Horney, who's a psychoanalyst of yesteryear, who wrote one of my favorite books called Neurosis and Human Growth, The Struggle for Self-Realization. But then the minute I say those things, it's like, yeah, but then I want Gandhi and Shakespeare and Mother Teresa. So I'm not sure I could be, but I'll stick with my first triad.
Okay, I mean, I'll draw in the other ones you said. I mean, between that whole six, there seems to be an underlying current of, not to sound too soppy, but love and
Absolutely.
understanding. Okay, so is that a big thing for you in relation to death as a way to?
Yeah, it really is. So wow, James, and thank you for yanking that out, because I do think that there's two things that when someone's like, all right, haiku it for me. If you have to put all of the what's important on a fortune cookie, it would be the Abraham Lincoln idea of Lincoln said, it's not the years in your life, it's the life in your years. And I always like that as kind of a pithy way of pointing out what's at stake. And then there's the existential notion. And it's also just a frankly evolutionary one, and that is that we are uber social at our best, hyper empathetic individuals who thrive on care and compassion. Not only, very obviously, we are, all of us that are breathing today are the beneficiaries of someone else's care and compassion. But I think it's also the case, and here I'm relying on the Martin Heidegger when he talks about care as just a fundamental human attribute. And I kind of like that, because it reminds me that we don't come into the world like most Americans are now, just culturally constructed meat puppets, rarely transcending the monosyllabic utterance, as we kind of stumble our way through life. And rather, we're just naturally compassionate and concerned about those around us. Indeed, just the word consciousness, as I understand it, we got con, and everyone knows at the beginning that means with. And evidently, the shush part at the end is derived from a Greek word that means to know. So even just the basic idea of phenomenologically, we think that we're kind of self-contained individuals, in our own head. But even our subjective sense of self, as Nietzsche kept earnestly pointing out, it is the result of our ongoing intersections with our fellow humans. And so, yeah, I would say that that's what's striking about all of those folks.
Okay. Is there a topic that you'd like them to sort of? Do you think they gravitate towards, or do you think it'd just be a general conversation?
Well, I would ask all of them, as maybe this would be obvious, to just weigh in on their sense of things at the moment. And part of that is, as an American right now, it is actually very difficult for me to wake up on any given day and not see us as Lincoln must have woken up every day on the precipice of the Civil War. And so, that war never ended in America. And here we are back on the cusp of another one, almost literally. And so I see us on the threshold of fascism and making, unfortunately, steady progress in that direction. And I'd want to appeal to all of these folks for just some wisdom and insight about how to proceed. Even Bob Marley, for example, was intimately connected with the political affairs of Jamaica. And I love reading a book by the prime minister at the time, Michael Manley, talking about the role of the arts in fostering personal growth and social progress. So, yeah, that's what I would ask them first is, what do you think of what's up?
Okay. I'm sure these thinkers will come back in. I mean, especially that the idea of love is, one of the few things which can actually, this, as Becker makes clear, there's very little once you peel it away, which can truly deal with death.
That's right.
Perhaps love is one of those few things which we can utilize. But actually, I want to go back to your 8-year-old existential crisis that you had when you were younger, and it seems, it's often said that people get pets to teach kids things die, things end. But it's interesting that you said it's actually an existential crisis. Do you think there's a difference between people everyone knows you die, but do you think there's a key difference between knowing it and truly having that experience where you accept, right, that I'm a being of flesh, I'm gone soon? Do you think there's a big difference between
I
that
do.
actual acceptance?
James, that's awesome. So going back to Bob Marley, who feels it knows it. That knowing it requires an emotional recognition. That's why I tossed Karen Horney into my pile of people, because she, besides being an ardent feminist and leading the way for rendering psychological discourse a little bit more gender ecumenical, she was one of the first that I encountered who insisted that intellectual recognition is not only deceptive, but it could be counterproductive, because people could say all the time, I know that I'm going to die. Mm-hmm. All right, but this getting back to Heidegger, his point is that everybody says that for the most part. I know I'm going to die. And then, of course, if we had something tracking what was happening in their head, what they always go on to say is that I know I will die someday at some vaguely unspecified future moment. And Heidegger's point is that no, that's not getting to where Camus wants us to get, come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible. That's death denial for Heidegger when you say, I'm going to die someday. Because what you're doing is defensively inserting these imaginary chunks of time that separates you from your always impending doom. So genuine acceptance of our mortality is the realization that a comet could come through my office window and take my head off as I speak, or I can walk outside and get, smote by the virus and so on. And so, to get back to your fine point, James, this is something, and in psychobabble these days, they're talking about embodied cognition, mm-hmm. which is a very, finally, the psychologists are getting back to the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers when they realize that whatever it is that we call ourselves is inextricably connected to a physical carcass that is not only energized by our cognitions, but more directly influenced by our emotions. And so it's got to be an integrated beyond just thinking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what do you think society would look like if every single person did do as Heidegger and Camus says that we should do, if everyone just had a true acceptance and had that idea that, in the next minute they could die? Do you think there'd be some big key differences, or do you think things might actually just go on along the same?
Yeah, wow. I'd love to do that experiment. The hope would be that there would be fundamental differences, because in our work, what we argue is that a substantial proportion of humankind's most unsavory characteristics are the result of malignant manifestations of repressed death anxiety. And so, we do studies showing, for example, when we remind people that they're going to die, for the most part, they become racists and bigots. They like their own tribe more, and they disparage, dehumanize, and are even willing to destroy anyone that they consider the other. right? When we remind people that they're going to die, it makes them more supportive of populist and charismatic political leaders like Hitler or Orange Hitler, Donald Trump, as I call him. And indeed, our studies show that subtle death reminders have profound effects on political preferences. We remind people that they're going to die, and they become uncomfortable with their bodies, and they become more eager to trash the natural environment. They become insatiable consumers of money and stuff. And our death reminders, moreover, magnify all existing psychological disorders. And so, to be glib, our point is that if we don't do something, we're in trouble. That these non-optimal reactions to non-conscious reminders of death, they're literally they're turning us into humankind at our worst. Just these hateful, warmongering proto-fascists plundering the planet in our insatiable zeal for money and stuff, and like a TV, Facebook, Twitter stupor. And in our more histrionic moments, we're like with Robert J. Lifton. He said, "Look, we may be the first form of life to be responsible for our own extinction." So to be extreme, what I would like to think is that, and this is what we argue in the Worm at the Core book, we're at a psychological crossroads. We can keep being death-denying creatures, in which case we're just sawing our own branch off of the tree of life, or individually and collectively, we could make efforts to come to terms with our mortality. And one way, there was a guy, Geza Roheim, who's a Hungarian anthropologist, and he just said, civilization is like a baby who's afraid of the dark. And we're like, it's time for humankind to get out of diapers. And we talk about it in terms of existential maturity, to have the collective courage to accept with grace and humility the reality of our condition, which is that we have this unbelievable and basically undeserved existence. It's great that we're alive. And the hope is that we can not be so arrogant as to proclaim any more purview than any other living thing that has ever existed in the history of Earth. And so, this may sound maybe like Mary Poppins mixed with Walt Disney. But I would like to think that if people were genuinely accepting of their own mortality, that we would see less of these other, like I keep referring them to, not particularly optimal human behaviors.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's fairly morbid. That sort of those studies you put forward, you spoke about there, that when we were reminded of our mortality, that we sort of just double down on the defense mechanisms, which we've, the things which are keeping death at bay in an artificial sense, which Becker goes on about, whether it's, institutions, religion, populist movements, nations, the idea of adhering to some form of collective comfort. We just double down on them instead of, but I guess that once again, is that difference between acceptance and knowledge of death? Like, that's knowledge of death, saying, oh, I know about death, but I'll just stay here. Whereas acceptance it's something beyond that. So, I mean, this is a super tough question. I guess it's the one that in terror management theory, you're always trying to work towards is what do you think it takes for someone to bridge that gap to go from knowing about death, which we all do, to truly accepting it and actually then using that as a springboard to, as a trajectory for your life from then on? What do you think it takes to really embed it in someone?
Now that I don't know. No, I applaud the question. I say this when generally if I get a chance to talk to folks, and I mean this as a compliment. Anytime I get a fantastic question of genuine importance, I'm like, dude, if I could answer that, I'd be chugging rum out of a coconut. with my Nobel Prize on a beach. Not to sound defensive, but my buddy Jeff Greenberg, if he were here with us, what he would say is, that's an awesome and a critically important question that what we call terror management theory is not equipped to address. We were really trying, Becker writes all these books where he's like, here's what death denial, here's the toll that it takes on us. And indeed, everything that he says that we've looked at empirically, that he turns out to be quite right. Where he is less able to be of use, and us too, is okay, how do we parlay this knowledge into practical advice about how to proceed in light of it? And that's where I'm like, who knows? I mean, you've got the philosophers. So Socrates, I think, who said, to philosophize is to learn how to die. And of course, Montaigne said the same thing, picking up on Socrates. And so, one possibility is that this is a lifelong task that ought be undertaken early and often. And indeed, there are theological traditions that converge on the same thought. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the medieval monks, working with the skulls on their desk. And so that would be one approach, but surely not the only one. But, I like the existential psychotherapy types, like who would it be? Rollo May and Irvin Yalom. And they write about, well, all right, what up? What are the implications of this psychodynamically? Yeah, and they're like, well, every human has these universal concerns. We're all concerned about death, whether we know it or not. And we're all concerned about the implications of that fact for our choices and our sense of freedom. And we all, from time to time, experience pangs of existential isolation when we realize that no one's going to die for us. And that all of these things run the risk of putting us in an unfortunate state of meaninglessness. And the argument that I find compelling is that there's no one recipe for any of us in therapy or in terms of our own personal explorations, because you might have lots of concerns about death. But if you're working with a therapist existentially, well, that might never arise. You might spend your time thinking about issues concerning meaning or freedom, and a successful resolution of those concerns might assuage existential anxieties where they need not be explicitly confronted, which is just my long-winded way of saying that I'm not sure there is just one recipe, but I would submit that at least holistically, a good start would be to recognize that Western civilization, as we know it, is one giant and appalling effort to deny death. So there's the recognition that of the role of existential anxieties that perfuse throughout the culture. And yeah, then there's the along with that, the implications for how that would affect education broadly defined. And what I mean there is that usually the most important things in life, I call it LSD, love, sex, and death, have no place in most either educational or religious curriculums. And it seems to me that we need to start addressing those concerns a whole lot earlier and realize that little kids are existentialists much sooner and more profoundly than most of us are willing to concede. If you ask parents about their children, they're like, my kids aren't concerned about death, 5 or 6 year old kids. And there's a famous study where I think it was Sylvia Anthony, a British woman, writes about this in the 1950s or something. You ask parents, what are your 5 and 6-year-old kids more concerned about? Are they more concerned about dying or a spelling test? And the parents are like, my kids don't even know what death is. Of course, they're more worried about their test. Right, but then you ask the kids, and they're like, fuck spelling. I'm much more concerned about life and death. So I guess my point is that, yeah, I would lobby for just pronounced changes in the way that we interact with these notions about life and death that make it more possible to engage folks early and often in those domains in age-appropriate ways. You don't tell your 2-year-old in diapers that they can be summarily obliterated at any moment and to get used to it.
I mean, there's a couple of questions. I mean, one thing is that I think, especially when you're talking about kids having that existential sort of despair, I'm not sure it's despair, because would you agree that when you're that age, you haven't had the time to, inherit the personality of the Western world? So
that's right.
Your understanding or your opinion or your reaction to what death is, in quotation marks, you've defined that by your own means. You might think, oh, this is interesting. At one point, I'm not alive anymore. What does that mean? But everything else teaches you, oh no, death, death's awful. We have to hide it from you.
Yes.
People say, like, when parents or grandparents die, sometimes they tell young kids, oh, they've gone on holiday because it's the worst thing ever. But I feel if we moved away from that attitude of like death and suffering being the worst things that could ever be, you might develop a more productive relationship with it, where we're not all going around with this deep-seated fear.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. I think that's the direction to go in.
And I mean, there's another question there, because you bring up the Western world. Do you think, because I did some research recently into overpopulation, and the average life expectancy in 1800 was 30, and the average life expectancy now is around 80 for the Western world. So do you think nowadays, modern times, our fear of death is far worse because we don't really deal with it on average scale? Most people won't deal with it until way later in life.
Yeah, again, James, I think you make a fine point. Now, of course, I wasn't there back in the day, but now my joke is like, wow, I'm 67. So I'm going to live at least till my age reaches my IQ at 70. But back in the day, 30 years to wrap it up. And then infant mortality rate was like 50% in the West. There's no doubt that death was more poignant and pronounced and immediate, and that we have gone to extraordinary lengths to distance ourselves from death, not only by not dying. I'm a big fan of living, by the way, but as Ernest Becker points out, ironically and tragically, as technology has improved and our life expectancy has expanded, we've become more afraid of death, but not less afraid. And I like how he explains it. He's like, well, if your life expectancy is 30 and you're 10 years old and fall off a mountain and die, yeah, that's tragic because you've just lost 20 years of your life. But what if you expected to live to 70? Well, that's uber tragic. And then what if we get life extension so you can expect to live to 1 million? Becker's point is that that may make us even more hyper anxious about dying, because you might be able to banish death, but you'll never be able to banish chance events that run the risk of our obliteration. So you have a lot of the folks saying, oh yeah, let's just get rid of our bodies and upload our identity onto a computer cloud. But my joke to those folks is, oh, so that sounds fine, but let's remember you're going to be dead, and whoever you are is on a cloud in like Phoenix, Arizona, someplace, which within 10 years will be uninhabitable. And do you think when the electrical grid goes down that whoever owns your identity on a cloud is going to bother to be sure that you're still in existence. My point is that I see just increasingly strenuous efforts to extend ourselves in ways that I believe to be pathological manifestations of death denial. And this is a hard one because I like I say, I like living. I'm trying to have it both ways, but I think it's arrogant and unfortunate for any of us to proclaim a superiority to any other thing that's ever been alive. And every other thing that's ever been alive comes to an end. I just have a problem with this idea that there's something desirable and justifiable about extending any of us in perpetuity.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean that brings it a good point that you brought up the quote earlier. It's not the years in your life, it's the life in your years. You know, it's what you do with it, the intensity of your understanding, your knowledge, your experiences. You know, there's people who've probably lived to 30 who've had better lives than many people who in the West who live to 80 in some dead end job, never really understanding or exploring the world. Which, you know, you bring up the reason I bring this up is because you bring up life extension, and I think in the West, life extension, when you end up, something happens when you're 70 or 60 that we consider sort of a bug because, you know, you've got ill and people aren't meant to die or whatever, and they flood you with pills and you've got a pacemaker in, and slowly more and more robotics and artificial external things have to come in to maintain your life. And for this for me always really brings to the fore how terrified we are, because it's not at that point you're not actually maintaining, you're not asking a question of quality. You're not saying, well, what were you doing with your life? You know, are you truly experiencing life? It's just a question of quantity. Like, we need to keep you going because life has to keep going. And, you know, I mean, I don't know what you'd make of that, but I'm just putting the point in there that I think life extension isn't really what we think it is. It's an absolute, you know, terrifying thing, because often people are kept alive simply as, like, you know, there's no longer anyone there that you actually, you know, there's no, not to get too soppy and use the wrong language, but there's no soul or essence there anymore. It's almost like just a piece of meat being kept alive for the mere fact it is alive.
Yeah. And again, I think there's, like any complicated idea, people of goodwill could have spirited disagreement. Mm-hmm. But I concur with your view that beyond an admirable effort to improve public health in ways that have a byproduct, which is to extend our lives, that's different than to be solely preoccupied with maximizing the amount of time that one happens to be breathing, even if you're reduced to a respiring pincushion with relatively meager opportunities. So yes.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind if I ask you, are you religious? What's your view of, for you, is anything happen after death?
Yeah, I get I'm going Epicurean these days on that, which is that, you know, I am a momentary aggregation of molecules that have existed since the Big Bang, that coagulated for you know, a fleeting moment in order to compose me. And that when this particular entity that I define as myself has physically expired, that those same atoms will then be on their way to engage with fellow molecules in the cosmos, perhaps to you know, band up and form a lizard or a potato or a star or maybe another person. And again, to each their own, but maybe it's that I'm on the cusp of senility. But the older I've gotten, James, I find that not terrifying. So here I am being disinclined to die, literally terrified for most of my life. And again, I have no interest in dying in the near future if I can help it. But yeah, more and more, I'm comforted. I call it radical insignificance. You know, and it may sound corny, but it has the virtue of being true. We are all come into the world at a time and a place not of our choosing, ensconced in a body that is similarly not by virtue of our own choices, and we're here for an infinitesimally small amount of time in a cosmos, the dimensions of which we are still unaware, but we do know it to be benignly indifferent to our fate. And so you can either be like Pascal, the mathematician, completely mortified by that realization, or you go with the Epicureans and the Lucretius types who are uplifted by that thought, and who, moreover, point out the complications of thinking otherwise. And so back in the day, the gods were immortal and miserable. It was boring and banal to live forever, and as like the ancients point out. And and I also I think it's Lucretius who just says, think of life as like a banquet. And it's like, think of any stellar meal that you've ever had. Well, the fact is that one of the things that makes it great is that you get to the end of it. Or think of the best novel that you've ever read. Well, it wouldn't be the best if it never ended. And so I just like this idea that, as odd as it sounds, that all of us are ultimately unfulfilled until the moment that we no longer are. I think that's a Heidegger notion, that none of us will be around to witness the completion of our lives. But that shouldn't dissuade us in principle from appreciating that what makes life so poignantly sweet is the vague and not so vague awareness that it's not infinite.
I mean, well, that of course brings forth the interesting question of, we've always, whether or not you're religious, whether or not you agree with the principle of an afterlife, which is an eternity of existence in some form, or in the more contemporary way, Ray Kurzweil with, as you've already mentioned, uploading your consciousness so you're alive for eternity there. But that brings forward which is a question which I think Heidegger dealt with directly, which is, well, okay, if you live forever, then all the things which give us meaning in our life, many of them, if not most of them, only have that purpose and meaning because they're understood on a finite time frame. So there's always the question, it's sort of like the Groundhog Day question is, well, in what sense does anything have any meaning or purpose if it's on a scope of infinity?
Yes.
The whole point of saying, well, which is why I guess we respect people who say, well, I've dedicated my life to a certain tiny facet of human culture. You respect that because this person has understood, I've got a small amount of time on this earth, and I have used it on, being a scholar of Husserl or something, and that's why where the respect comes. Because if you live forever and you said, I spent 80 years studying Nietzsche, you go, well, it doesn't matter because you've got another infinity years.
Yeah. No, James, I love that point, and I can't remember, and it doesn't matter. There's a philosopher named Martha Nussbaum, and she wrote about that notion, and I do think that it's important when I talk about it, and I'm being kind of a dick, I guess, but I'm like, the very notion of meaning would be meaningless if we lived forever. Not you put it beautifully. Nothing would matter. The way Martha Nussbaum put it is like, well, what does it mean to say that someone was generous or courageous? So what? I helped you across the street. I got hit by a car, but no matter, because I'm living forever. Or I gave you my lunch, but no matter, I'll have another one. And Nussbaum points out that the things that render humans at our best, most noble and heroic, are actions that are undertaken to varying degrees in light of the awareness of our finitude. And I find that quite compelling.
I mean, and that brings forward a question of I think, really the difference between mortality and immortality is one of being human, right?
Yeah.
Because as soon as you have that immortality, everything is what are the reasons for being human is being mortal. And do you think there's some truth in that sense of, as soon as you try eradicate death, which is this solely human thing, you do become extremely machinic. You become a sort of machine, because you're working then on what spectrum are you working, if not with the finitude of life?
Yeah. Again, but perhaps not surprisingly, yeah, I agree with that. There's a guy, Alexander Smith. He's a Scottish dude who wrote an essay in the 1860s where he says, "It is our knowledge that we have to die that makes us human." Mm-hmm. And I really find that as compelling today as when I bumped into that, phrase decades ago. I think that sums it up pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I sort of, I don't normally ask these kinds of questions, but you've made it clear that you enjoy living, and I know, you, in terms of the Western world, you're still, you're still pretty young. I have this compulsion to ask this now. I mean, if you knew you were to die in 2 days' time, how would your thinking change?
I hope not at all, but that's awesome question. I ask myself that all the time, because, and and this is one of these questions, not to sound like a researcher, but that is what I do for a living. And that is, you could ask anybody you want, and my guess is whatever they say wouldn't matter unless it was actually happening. So I'm going to tell you that if I knew I was going to live for 2 more days, that it would alter not one thing, because my hope would be, channeling Heidegger, that he says, if you're living authentically, you always have plenty of time. Mm-hmm. And that, another point, not claiming to understand the Heidegger or anything, rather, is, I like the idea of just thinking like that, but I don't know. I really don't know. Half of me is like, I wouldn't do anything else because my days are rich, and I'm at a point. And again, I don't know if I actually live up to these ideals, but I talk a good talk. I'm like, okay, I like that I'm a psychologist and that we've written some books and that people are interested, but I don't want to, I have to be ever vigilant to the possibility that this is my own yearning for immortality getting the better of me by rendering me comfortably numb in light of the adulation that we get for our work. Yeah, we're proud of our work, but it's a beautiful day in New York today. And I was equally enamored with taking a walk in the woods with our dog this morning. And so I'd like to think in my, ideal world, I'm going to die. And so I'll keep doing whatever I would do in pursuit of authenticity. On the other hand, I am, my fear is that if you told me I was going to die in 2 days, that I would already be on the internet, ordering a 50-pound block of chocolate and a wheelbarrow of every psychoactive substance that I've tried over the decades. And as I max out all of my credit cards for an around the world flight, in a first class cabin, I hope I wouldn't do that.
No. Do you think there might be a third option, though, for some people, that you just panic? You wouldn't get anything done? You just...
Absolutely. No, because that's a great... No, James, I think that's a great description of all too many people, myself included from time to time. Because again, Heidegger, he talks about a flight from death in light of the awareness of our own mortality. And he's like, some people, in light of that, they just become like comfortably numb. So they're the ones, sitting at home, drinking beer, spraying cheese whiz on a cracker, watching TV. But another way to be tranquilized by the trivial is just to be frenetic. I got to go shopping. I got to do better in my career. And I think a lot of us in the West are in a low-grade state of perpetual panic. And in fact, I'll go one up in light of the pandemic and the economic insecurities that now pervade the world. Yeah, I think a large chunk of Earth is in a state of existential anxiety fueled panic reactions. I don't think that's an overstatement right now.
Do you think that, and that's because basically those sort of Becker institutions, that idea, those institutions have been uprooted, but not enough really to transform anything fundamentally. So we can, they've been uprooted a bit. We can just about see underneath them. And there's enough there to say, but we all know that COVID-19 has sort of proved that actually a lot of what we rely on is complete BS. But it hasn't done it enough that it's gone. So we're sort of all left going, do you still believe the illusion? Yeah, me too, you know?
There you go. Perfect.
But where'd you go? Where'd you go from that? Do you think it would be more beneficial to rip the Band-Aid off and rebuild?
Maybe, because again, you're channeling Nietzsche. That was his, the gay science, 1880 something, his famous proclamation, God is dead. And I always say, got to read the rest of the paragraph, because he's like, Christianity has become unbelievable. That was exactly his point, as I understand it, James, that we're caught between illusions, where life is such. It was already happening between, the theory of evolution, the Industrial Revolution, the remarkable success of capital-based economic organization sure made religion seem like quaint nonsense. Now we have the pandemic has now, for some folks, blown away any subsidiary or remaining pretense of the viability of these worldviews. But nothing has yet emerged to replace them. So, guy on your end of the pond, John Gray, a philosopher who I admire, he's like, our religious belief systems are no longer potent, but the universal human needs that underlie them remain as strong as ever. So here we are, fundamentally death-denying creatures, divested of the belief systems that got us through life for thousands of years, in the middle of a deadly pandemic that can't help but arouse existential anxieties. And I think that that's a fine, in a nutshell, explanation for why, on top of public health concerns, there is so much psychosocial dis-ease. I'm saying that word to put a hyphen between dis and ease that prevails right now.
Yeah, it reminds me of in John Gray's Straw Dogs, he says the only savior of the human race will be the one which teaches us we don't need a savior.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, so I think there's a book that got me into philosophy, actually. So,
really?
Yeah, I haven't heard too many people referencing John Gray, but he seems stuck as well. Like he's got in a loop as well, so he hasn't really, I don't know, he hasn't taken the full leap somewhere. Like he's destroyed a lot of things that we rely on, such as progress and the notion of salvation, but he's also still stuck in that same, like, okay, well, where do we go?
Yeah. And of course, that's I think that's reasonable. He was very charitable. He reviewed our book, The Worm at the Core, for British newspapers. And he's like, look, these guys, this is the most compelling empirical demonstration of the veracity of Becker's claims that death anxiety underlies a substantial proportion of human activity. And then he just literally tears us apart, because he's like, okay, these guys do a good job of showing how much death anxiety influences everything that people do, and then they have the audacity to offer some limp-wristed palliatives at the end that will surely be insufficient to address a problem of this magnitude, and that's fair, because it is easier to delineate the nature of the existential problem than it is to prescribe anything with regard to what to now do. And, I read every one of John Gray's books as they come out, and I admire each of them. But you make a good point, James, and this is not a criticism so much as an observation, is that he's especially good at explaining to us why secular society is just an atheistic religious worldview that is ultimately rather superficial and unfulfilling compared to the ones that we've abandoned by adopting what we now have. And I think that's right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. We seem to have got to we've got to that dead end thing, which you get to, and that's no criticism of you. It is the question is, once you've realized that big problem, where do you go from there? But I mean, we're getting on for now. So is there anything you feel we've missed about the book that you'd like to add in?
No, just James, to thank and appreciate folks like you that are trying to engage with these ideas in ways that fosters wider dissemination. Because, it's like, here we are again, where it always drifts, which is, okay, what now? And I like Ernest Becker at the end of the Escape from Evil book when he said, I don't know. In fact, by the end of his life, he said, I'm pessimistic, but I'm not cynical. Mm-hmm. And I like that. He just said, look, I think we're on a path to self-destruction. But he still couldn't help it, nor can I. He subscribed to the Enlightenment ideal that on a good day, if enough of us became sufficiently aware of what underlied our concerns, we might be able to do something about it. Mm-hmm. So we weren't getting anywhere with the plague while we were saying it's because of evil spirits. Mm-hmm. All right, but then we figure out it's bacteria. And then we get modern medicine, which its problems notwithstanding is responsible for most of us who are currently breathing still being here. Well, the goal then would be, and Becker said, well, I wish that these ideas were, why aren't they talking about them at the UN? Why aren't these ideas being discussed on television and in schools? And I think unless somebody has anything better to propose, that would be a good step one, which is to make enough people on Earth aware of these ideas in the service of hoping that some will ponder them sufficiently to be affected by them. Mm-hmm. But we don't, and again, this may sound naive, but there could be the next Jesus or Buddha or Lincoln out there who's going to be able to use these ideas in ways that have radically transformative consequences. But at my point in life, I highly doubt that if that happens, it's because somebody has read one of the papers about our experiments. My point is that's a non-pharmacological intervention for insomnia. We're going to do our research, and that's what we do. And the 12 people on Earth that read our papers, hopefully they'll be inspired by them. But I see in the world that we now reside in, the best vehicle for dispersal is not in the academy. It's folks like you saying, I want to have my proverbial antenna in the cosmic mist, and I want to get folks that have ideas that we can talk about, and then I want to toss them out there. And, just to go thorough on you, I think there's something in Walden where he throws a pebble in the pond, and then he talks about how, you got these concentric circles that keep going out and that you can't tell what the ripple effects of one's thoughts and utterances might have. And so back to my point is that I applaud what you're doing. And this is what I think is most necessary to spread these ideas, not because I say them, they're not my ideas. Our view has always been that there's nothing original about our work. except that we're not claiming to be original. We're just saying these are important ideas, and we think that there's a boatload of evidence in support of them.
I mean, that's sort of a frustration, though, because of many of the academics and people who are lecturers who are working within the academy all sort of agree on that it's gone, it's gone away from that original foundation of a discussion which is meant to influence, things. And I'm not a Marxist, but, it always makes me laugh that Marx's statement that, we need action. You're meant to change the world, not just talk about it. That seems to be the one quote by Marx that the entire academy has just avoided, because it's slowly getting more and more constrained to the point where you go, well, and I don't mean this in a horrible way towards it, but as you said, sort of sarcastically, as you will probably understand, papers, when you say the 12 people who read my paper, it's like, you probably wrote an amazing paper, but something within the academies, the way it's structured, it just constrains everything. And you think, the most theses are read by 4 people, the writer, the marker, and maybe a couple of editors. And the ideas are sort of stagnating. But I think the academy realizes this. I think most of them do. But how you get out of it, I don't know.
Yeah, but I think this is a good start. So this is my view is let's start by spreading stuff around. And and the one thing I would say to folks that are hearing us converse is to just feel free to reach out. The people who know how to use the internet, I'm at Skidmore College in New York, so email me if you want to exchange ideas. I'm sure folks know how to find you. And that's the hope. That I sure enjoyed our conversation today, but this wasn't about our mutual pleasure as much as hopefully being fruitful and of interest to the people who partake of it.
Exactly. Are you working on anything at the moment? Anything new? Or
I'm just right now, to be silly, I'm working on making it through the day. And I've got a variety of things that I'm excited about. I have one project with some very talented writers, and it's a science fiction podcast about an artificial intelligence, a robot smarter than any of us, who finds out that she's mortal and that her creators made her mortal. The question is, would a robot who found that she was mortal, how would that entity react? Anyway, I just find that, it's the overriding question of that project is about AI morality. Can you have a moral machine? And the folks that are dabbling in this, they want to, and if that's the case, if a machine is going to be moral, does it have to be embodied? And I like all of these. So I'm on one project doing that. And then I'm working with some very talented physicians. We're designing existential therapy for traumatized healthcare workers. So, one of the things that we don't talk about enough, at least in the US, is that the healthcare system is almost overwhelmed with psychosocial difficulties from taking care of people. And so we're going to try and test the efficacy of existential approaches to healthcare workers who have been adversely affected by their work. And then I'm working with some other folks. We want to try and write a book about moral identity. And this has to do with most books these days about political philosophy and moral issues are based on assumptions about human nature that are demonstrably false. And so we're going to try and step back and think about, in light of what we now know about human nature, what would be the best way to proceed in terms of political and economic organization in order to enhance individual development and social progress. I think that's it. And then I want to play the 3 chords that I play badly on the guitar for the last 30 years. I want to be able to play them a little better. And that's about it.
Okay. Whereabouts can we find your work? Is there a central place, or is it sort of?
No, not at all. So we're kind of, if you want, you can look stuff up, but just write to me, I think, is the best way to find stuff about us.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like a good place to finish up. Sheldon Solomon, thanks very much.
Thank you, James.